When someone says, "I'm in love with a married man," the statement often carries a quiet mixture of emotion, confusion, longing, excitement, and sometimes even shame. But before we rush to judge the situation, it's important to pause and recognize something very human about it. People rarely plan to fall in love in complicated circumstances. Love does not typically arrive after a careful analysis of someone's relationship status or the structural implications of a connection. It usually begins in far simpler ways. Two people meet, they talk, they feel understood. There is a moment of recognition, something in the conversation, the humor, the emotional openness that creates a sense of closeness. And closeness is powerful. When someone feels seen or appreciated in a way that resonates deeply, the emotional bond can begin forming almost quietly. What begins as a conversation becomes a habit of communication. What begins as curiosity becomes interest. And gradually, without anyone formally announcing it, the connection moves into a more intimate emotional space. This is often how these relationships begin, not as an affair in the dramatic sense, but as an evolving emotional connection. The difficulty arises when the realization appears. The person you're growing attached to already has another life, a marriage, a home, a shared history with someone else. At this moment, the mind begins to recognize a reality that the heart did not initially consider. Many people respond to this realization by telling themselves a story that allows the connection to continue. They may say, "His marriage is complicated," or "They are emotionally distant," or "This is different from anything he has experienced before." Sometimes these explanations come from the married partner himself. Other times they arise naturally, as the person tries to make sense of the emotional intensity they are experiencing. But what makes this situation so psychologically complex is that two things can be true at the same time. The feelings may be genuine, and the circumstances may still be deeply unstable. One of the most difficult ideas for people to accept is that authenticity of feeling does not automatically create security in a relationship. Love can be sincere while the structure around it remains uncertain. This is the emotional paradox at the center of loving someone who is married. The connection may feel real, the conversations may be meaningful, the affection may be expressed with honesty and warmth. In those moments, the relationship can feel deeply validating, even transformative. But outside those moments exists another reality. The marriage continues to exist as well. This dual structure creates an emotional landscape that is very different from most traditional relationships. In a typical partnership, two people gradually build a shared life together. They move toward visibility, integration, and stability. In this situation, however, the connection exists alongside an already established life, and that difference shapes everything that follows, because relationships are not sustained by emotion alone. They are sustained by position, by where each person stands within the other's life. Who shares daily routines? Who is recognized publicly as the partner? Who participates in the long-term decisions about life, family, and future? These questions may not appear immediately, but eventually they begin to surface. At first, the relationship may exist in a space of emotional intensity and private moments. The secrecy can even create a feeling of intimacy. There is a sense that something special exists between the two of you, something separate from the rest of the world. But over time, the awareness of the other life becomes more difficult to ignore. The partner leaves after your time together to return to his home. Certain holidays are unavailable. Certain parts of his life remain closed. These boundaries are not necessarily created with cruelty. Often they simply reflect the structure of the life he is already living. Yet emotionally, they introduce a subtle but powerful question. Where do I truly exist in this person's life? This question is not only about jealousy or comparison. It is about psychological grounding. Human beings naturally seek clarity about their place in a relationship. We want to know whether we are part of someone's future or simply part of a moment in their present. And when someone is in love with a married man, that clarity can be difficult to find, because the emotional experience may suggest closeness and importance, while the structural reality suggests distance and limitation. This tension does not mean the love is false. It simply means that love alone cannot resolve the complexities of the situation. Understanding this is not about condemning the relationship. It is about recognizing its emotional architecture, because once we see the structure clearly, we can begin asking deeper questions, not just about the relationship, but about what we truly need in order to feel secure in love. And that reflection begins with a simple but powerful realization. Love may begin with connection, but security always depends on the place we occupy in someone's life. If we continue this conversation, the next question naturally emerges. Why does insecurity grow so quickly in a relationship that may feel so emotionally powerful? The answer lies less in the depth of feeling and more in the conditions under which the relationship exists. Emotional security in love does not come only from affection, it comes from visibility, consistency, and a shared place in each other's lives. When those elements are missing, even a very intense bond can begin to feel unstable. Think about what usually allows people to relax inside a relationship. They know when they will see each other. They know where they stand. They are part of each other's routines, families, and plans. The relationship exists not only in private moments, but in the open landscape of daily life. But when someone is involved with a married partner, the relationship often lives in a very different environment. It exists largely in the shadows. Time together must be negotiated around another life. Messages may need to be discreet. Meetings may happen during narrow windows that appear and disappear, depending on schedules that are not fully shared. At first, this secrecy can create an intoxicating sense of intimacy. There is a feeling that the relationship belongs only to the two of you. The privacy may even intensify the emotional connection because what is hidden often feels more precious. But secrecy also has a psychological cost. When a relationship cannot fully exist in the open, it becomes difficult to build the kind of stability that people instinctively seek in love. You may feel deeply connected to the person, but you cannot fully integrate into their life. Certain parts of their world remain closed. And over time, the mind begins to fill those closed spaces with questions. Where is he right now? What is he feeling when he is with his wife? Does she know him in ways I don't? These questions do not necessarily arise from insecurity in the traditional sense. They arise from the structure of the situation itself. Human beings rely on information to feel emotionally grounded. When information is limited, imagination naturally fills the gaps. The result is often a cycle of emotional intensity followed by uncertainty. You may spend a few hours together and feel completely connected. In those moments, the relationship feels vivid, alive, almost undeniable. The conversations may be deep, the affection may feel sincere. It may even seem as if the two of you understand each other in ways that transcend ordinary relationships. And then the moment ends. He returns to his other life. The communication slows, the access disappears. Suddenly, the emotional landscape changes. The same relationship that felt secure a few hours earlier now feels distant. Not necessarily because anything dramatic happened, but because the conditions of the relationship shifted. This fluctuation can be exhausting. The emotional highs are powerful, but the uncertainty between them becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. What makes this especially challenging is that many people in these relationships interpret their insecurity as a personal weakness. They might think, why am I so jealous? Why do I feel so anxious? Why can't I just enjoy what we have? But the truth is much simpler. The relationship itself is structurally unstable. It is not designed to provide the type of emotional continuity that helps people feel safe. When a connection must remain partially hidden, partially available, and partially integrated into someone's life, it naturally creates ambiguity. And ambiguity is the environment in which insecurity thrives. Another important dynamic emerges here as well: comparison. Even if the wife is never mentioned directly, her presence is unavoidable. She represents the visible life that you cannot fully access. She occupies a position that the relationship with you cannot easily replicate. This comparison can become emotionally consuming, not because you necessarily want to compete with her, but because her existence constantly reminds you of the limits of your role. And limits create uncertainty. People often assume that security in love comes from reassurance. They hope the partner will say the right words, offer enough affection, or promise a future that resolves the tension. But reassurance alone rarely solves structural insecurity. You can hear, "I care about you" many times, and still feel unsettled if the relationship cannot move into a more stable form. Words may soothe the moment, but structure shapes the long-term emotional experience. This is why so many people in these relationships live with a quiet sense of waiting. Waiting for clarity, waiting for a decision, waiting for the possibility that the relationship might one day move from the margins into the center of someone's life. But waiting can also become its own emotional trap, because the longer a relationship remains undefined, the more energy it consumes without necessarily moving towards stability. And this brings us to a deeper realization about love and security. Security does not come from how intensely someone feels about you. It comes from how clearly you exist within their life. Affection may live in private moments, but security requires a place in the visible world. So the real question is not simply whether the love is real. The deeper question is whether the structure of the relationship allows that love to become something stable enough to live in. And that question is where the next stage of reflection begins. Because the moment we understand that insecurity is not a personal failure but a structural reality, we gain the ability to ask a far more important question. Is this relationship giving me the kind of emotional ground on which a life can actually stand? Once we recognize that the instability of the relationship is not simply a matter of emotions but of structure, another layer of the experience begins to reveal itself. And this layer is deeply internal. It lives inside the person who is in love and trying to make sense of what their heart wants and what reality seems to offer. Because in relationships like this, people often live between two powerful psychological forces, hope and reality. Hope is extraordinarily resilient. It has the remarkable ability to reinterpret circumstances in ways that keep possibility alive. When someone is in love with a married partner, hope often takes the form of a quiet belief that the situation might eventually change. Maybe the marriage is already fragile. Maybe he stays only out of obligation. Maybe he just needs more time to make a difficult decision. These narratives are not necessarily invented out of denial. They often emerge from genuine conversations, from emotional moments where the partner expresses dissatisfaction, confusion, or longing for a different life. When someone says, "I've never felt this way before," or "I wish things were different," those statements can easily become seeds of hope. And hope, once planted, begins to shape how we interpret the future. It allows the relationship to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a story that is still unfolding, a story that might eventually arrive at a turning point where everything becomes clearer and more stable. But while hope looks toward the future, emotional reality lives in the present. And the present often contains a different set of signals. The marriage continues. Shared responsibilities remain in place. The partner returns each evening to a life that already exists, a life that has its own history, its own emotional gravity. This creates a psychological tension that is difficult to sustain over long periods of time. Part of the mind continues to imagine the possibility of change, while another part begins to notice the patterns that remain the same. Weeks become months, months become years, and the anticipated turning point does not always arrive. In these moments, people often experience a quiet form of emotional dissonance. On one hand, the relationship feels meaningful. It may provide deep conversation, intellectual companionship, emotional intimacy. There may even be genuine care and affection that flows both ways. But on the other hand, there is a growing awareness that the structure of the relationship has not fundamentally shifted. This is where many individuals begin asking themselves a very uncomfortable question. Am I waiting for something that may never happen? Waiting is not inherently negative. Many important decisions in life require patience. But waiting becomes psychologically costly when it occurs without clarity. Because the longer we remain in uncertainty, the more our emotional energy becomes tied to an outcome we cannot control. We begin organizing our lives around a relationship that still exists in an ambiguous space. We may postpone other possibilities, avoid forming new connections, or hesitate to imagine a future that does not include the person we love. And slowly, almost invisibly, our sense of emotional agency begins to shrink. The relationship, instead of being one part of a full life, starts to occupy a central role in determining our sense of direction. We become observers of someone else's decision-making process rather than active authors of our own future. This is not weakness. It is simply the natural consequence of loving someone deeply while hoping for a change that lies outside our control. But recognizing this dynamic can be profoundly liberating because it allows us to shift the focus of the conversation. Instead of asking endlessly, "What will he do?" we begin asking a different and far more empowering question. What am I choosing while I wait? Am I choosing patience because I genuinely believe the relationship is moving toward a clear future? Or am I choosing patience because the idea of letting go feels more painful than the uncertainty itself? This distinction matters. Love has the capacity to expand our lives, to deepen our sense of connection and possibility. But when hope becomes the primary force holding a relationship together, love can also become intertwined with prolonged ambiguity. And ambiguity rarely creates emotional peace. Clarity, even when it is difficult, tends to bring a certain kind of relief. Because clarity restores something essential, the ability to make conscious decisions about how we want to live and love. This does not mean that every relationship in this situation must end. Life is rarely that simple. But it does mean that the internal conversation must evolve beyond hope alone. At some point, every person deserves to ask themselves a courageous question. Not just whether the love is real, but whether the waiting is shaping the life they truly want to live. Because love should open the future, not suspend it indefinitely. And the moment we recognize that distinction is often the moment we begin reclaiming the authorship of our own story. If we follow this journey all the way through, from the emotional reality of the connection to the instability created by secrecy, to the tension between hope and reality, we arrive at a final and deeply important shift in perspective. And that shift is about where emotional security truly comes from. Because when someone is in love with a married partner, the instinct is often to search for security inside the relationship itself. We look for reassurance in words, promises, plans, or gestures that suggest we matter deeply to the other person. We listen carefully for signs that we are important enough, loved enough, chosen enough. This search is profoundly human. When love feels uncertain, we naturally want confirmation that we are valued and that the connection has a future. But there is a subtle danger in placing the entire weight of our emotional stability on someone else's decisions, especially when those decisions involve a life that already includes another commitment. Over time, the question that quietly dominates the emotional landscape becomes, what will he do? Will he leave? Will he choose this relationship? Will circumstances eventually change? And while these questions are understandable, they also place the center of gravity of your life in someone else's hands. Your sense of peace, direction, and security becomes dependent on a choice that you do not control. This is where a profound psychological turning point becomes possible. Instead of asking only what the partner will decide, the conversation begins to include a different question, one that shifts the focus back to the self. What kind of relationship allows me to feel secure, respected, and emotionally grounded? This question is not about blame. It is not about punishing the partner or dismissing the connection. It is about recognizing that love is not only something we feel, it is also something we build our lives around, and the structure of that love matters. Many people remain in relationships that keep them in a state of emotional suspension because they believe that leaving would mean losing the love itself. But this assumption deserves careful examination. Sometimes what we are truly afraid of losing is not the person, but the story we have been telling ourselves about the future. The story that says, one day this will become something stable. One day we will finally live openly. One day everything will align. Stories are powerful. They allow us to endure uncertainty because they promise eventual meaning. But emotional security rarely comes from waiting for the story to resolve itself. It comes from asking whether the present reality of the relationship aligns with the life we want to live. Reclaiming that perspective is not easy. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to examine our own needs honestly rather than minimizing them to preserve the relationship. For example, many people in these situations quietly lower their expectations over time. They tell themselves they don't need public recognition, shared holidays, or long-term planning. They say they are satisfied with the emotional connection alone. But human beings rarely thrive on partial belonging. We are relational creatures. We want to be chosen openly. We want to participate in the life of the person we love. We want a sense that the relationship is moving forward rather than existing in a permanent holding pattern. Recognizing these desires is not selfish. It is an expression of emotional integrity. And when we begin to honor that integrity, something powerful happens. The relationship stops being the sole source of identity and direction. Instead, it becomes one part of a much larger conversation about how we want to live, what we value, and what kind of love truly sustains us. At that point, the question of whether the relationship continues becomes less about fear and more about alignment. Does this connection support the life I want to build? Does it allow me to feel secure in who I am and where I stand? Does it create expansion, or does it keep me waiting? These questions do not demand immediate answers, but they do restore something essential: agency. Agency means recognizing that while we cannot control another person's choices, we always retain the ability to choose the conditions under which we give our love. And that realization transforms the emotional landscape. Instead of living in constant anticipation of someone else's decision, we begin shaping our own. We stop negotiating with uncertainty and start defining what we truly need in order to feel whole in a relationship. Because love, at its healthiest, is not something that keeps us suspended between possibility and doubt. It is something that allows us to stand firmly in our own lives while sharing that life with another person. And perhaps the most important truth to remember is this: the security we seek in love rarely begins with someone choosing us. It begins the moment we choose ourselves.